If I had to rank every single striking skill in order of importance, I would rank footwork at number 1. It's the foundation of everything. Without it, your striking will always suffer. But how do you translate a skill as important as footwork to a sim video game and not only make it look good, but also make it feel good? That is one of the questions UFC 6 will need to answer. The movement style you see in UFC 5 was first implemented in UFC 3, and since then, the style has remained the same. It's the thing that gives the current UFC games that very recognizable look. And when I say recognizable, I'm not saying it in a good way. Players are tired of it. I remember watching players' reactions to the initial footage of UFC 5, and a lot of people had a look of, wow, that looks just like UFC 4. They're sick of it. Players want a game that feels brand new. And what better way to instantly signal the fans that they are playing a brand new product as opposed to just another iteration of the last game than with a brand new movement style. Beyond that, it's about evolution. Imagine if UFC 6 became the very first game to find that happy medium. The movement looks good, feels good, and it's also responsive. Imagine how groundbreaking that would be. Now, I get why this is hard for developers. Realistic movement animations where fighters look like they have weights and they're not sliding all over the place is very tough to balance with the same movement also being very responsive, especially in a game like this where precision and timing are everything. Still, I can't help but think if other games have figured out ways to innovate in tough areas, why can't EA? I don't think it's easy by any stretch of the imagination, but I also don't think it's impossible. So what could they actually do? Well, let's start with what they could do to make footwork look good. The first thing they've got to do is reduce the amount of steps in one stride. We already have different movement styles in the game, like the gallop, the shuffle step, the push step, and the pendulum step. But a lot of times, especially when the fighters are moving laterally, the fighters take really short but fast steps, making the whole thing look cartoony. Now, I think the reason they did it this way is so that we can stop on a dime without having to take an extra step. If the strides are longer, for example, and you let go of the controller while the fighter is mid-stride, he might have to take an additional step to complete the movement, which of course puts you closer to your opponent than you intended and essentially makes playing footsies really, really hard. But for the sake of realism, I think this might be a necessary evil, unless they can figure out a way to increase the length of each stride while also allowing us to halt exactly when we want to. Next up is they've got to fix disjointed animations. Right now, it looks like the legs and upper body of fighters are completely disconnected. The legs move too fast, which we've already discussed, while the upper body animations don't match. Sometimes the fighter's lower body is completely squared up, meanwhile the upper body is still bladed. Sure, it's technically possible to move in this way, but why would you? You just look funny as hell. Simply put, it makes the movement look janky, ugly, and also unrealistic. If the lower body is bladed as you're moving, then the upper body should also be bladed. And if the lower body is squared up as you're moving, then the upper body should also be squared up. That's how a human being would move naturally. Next up is we absolutely need different locomotion speeds. Right now in UFC 5, if you feather your left stick, nothing happens. Your fighter doesn't move at all. You have to keep pushing the left stick almost all the way for the fighter to actually start moving. This should not be the case. If you feather the left stick, the fighter should inch forward, almost like they're stalking their opponent. If you push the stick further, the movement speed should increase. EA MMA did this very, very well. When you push the left stick very lightly, you'll notice the fighter inching very slowly towards the opponent. And as you push the stick all the way, the fighter's movement speed increases. I'd like to see this brought back to the next game. Now, a reasonable question is, why would anyone want to use the super slow stalking movement speed? What would be the incentive to use that as opposed to just moving around as fast as possible? I'm glad you asked. That's something we're going to discuss at a later time. I have some ideas for that. But for now, just keep in mind this needs to be brought back to the game. The next way they can make movement look good is by bringing back conservation of momentum. Conservation of momentum means that a fighter's movement should naturally carry through based on their speed and direction. For example, imagine someone running on a track. They don't instantly halt when they try to stop. Their body needs time to slow down and stabilize, so a lot of times they will actually keep moving forward a little bit before they come to a complete stop. This makes movement look deliberate and natural, especially at higher speeds. The same thing should be happening in the game. This is why I'm suggesting that they bring it back, but only for the highest locomotion speed. This could be maybe one incentive not to move as fast as you can at all times during gameplay, because then you can't just change directions as quickly as you can if your movement speed was a little bit lower. More on that later. Next up, they've got a motion capture unique fighter movement styles. It's not enough to just have archetypes, like how a boxer moves, how a wrestler moves, how a Muay Thai guy moves, and so on. Sure, some fighters in the UFC with a wrestling base do move around like a wrestler, but that's not always the case. Islam Makhachev, for example, stands up tall, even though he has every intention to dive on the legs. Specific fighter movement styles must be captured. This is one area Undisputed Boxing did an incredible job. It's not just about how the fighter moves though. UFC fighters have specific mannerisms they exhibit in the octagon. For example, Dustin Poirier likes to pull up on his shorts randomly, or Alex Pereira touching his nose every time he gets leg kicked. In boxing, an example would be Mike Tyson biting his gloves. These are habits that make fighters seem alive in there. We actually used to have these in the game. In UFC 1, 2, and 3, when the fighters, are not really moving when they're idle, or a lot of times even when they're not actually idle, they occasionally will perform actions unique to them. Like John Jones stretching out his arms, Benson Henderson brushing his hair in UFC 1. We need this back in the game. The last thing they could do to make footwork look realistic is by embracing imperfections. A vast majority of MMA fighters don't have textbook perfect footwork like boxers. They just don't. Even the best strikers in MMA, like Conor McGregor or Israel Adesanya, Max Holloway, these guys often break traditional footwork rules. They cross their feet, they square up to the opponent, they take awkward steps, they overstand on punches, losing their balance. Fighters like Jamal Hill or Dricus du Plessis have been able to become world champions even though their footwork is objectively terrible. The fact these guys have bad footwork doesn't mean they still can't be highly effective and dangerous fighters. I'd like to see EA embrace these imperfections and actually lean into them. It would add a ton of realism and variety to the game. So that's how I think they can make the movement look good. But how about how to make it feel good? How to make it more responsive? Well, in my opinion, the main reason movement feels off in sim-style video games is the lack of responsiveness. When controls feel delayed, even slightly, it breaks the immersion and leaves players frustrated. Responsiveness is everything. When I press a button, I want the action to happen immediately on screen. If I press a button and it takes half a second for the character on screen to actually start moving, it makes the game feel delayed and sluggish. This is something that traditional fighting games don't have to contend with because they can just cut animation frames and do whatever they gotta do to actually make the footwork of characters respond instantly. Because of this, characters in traditional fighting games can stop and change directions on a dime. With sim games though, you can't really do that. Humans have to adhere to the laws of physics, and physics doesn't always leave you in full control of your own body. I already mentioned this earlier, but if you're moving very quickly and try to stop, you're not just going to stop in the exact spot you want to stop. Your body will keep moving forward. That's constant velocity, Newton's first law. Same thing applies as a human is starting to move. Your entire body doesn't just zip to where you want to zip to. You gotta pick up speed. All of this in a video game context can feel extremely sluggish and unresponsive if it's done exactly the way physics dictates. This is actually one of the reasons I constantly get bored while trying to play Red Dead Redemption 2. The movement is very realistic, and although it fits perfectly with the extremely detailed world Rockstar crafted, I personally prefer a more arcade movement styles in games like that. It's why I like a game like Uncharted, for example. The movement might not have as much weight as a character in Red Dead Redemption, but it's far more responsive. This is what EA will be up against. What could they possibly do to respect the laws of physics while also making things feel responsive? Honestly, I don't know for sure, but I did notice something when it comes to that delayed feeling you get as you're trying to get a character to start moving. Undisputed Boxing has this problem, and the issue is, in my opinion, the startup frames and our perception of it. A lot of times, movement feels delayed because the startup frames are so small we can't see them. It's not that nothing happens when you actually input the command for your character to start moving, it's that the first thing that happens is so small it looks like the character is not moving at all, which then leads to the game feeling delayed. But what if that initial movement is exaggerated somehow? I'm still not 100% sure how it could be exaggerated, but I think exaggerating those startup frames can maybe fix this, because then when you press the button button, you'll visually see something happening right away. Now, this one, again, is still a work in progress in my head, but I think this could be a way to respect the laws of physics and also maintain responsiveness when starting a movement. Next part is when it comes to actually halting the movement. This is the part I'm not really sure if there's a way to get around, honestly, because an object in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by an external force. So like if you're galloping forward and immediately try to stop and change directions, your body will dip forward first before you can change the directions. That's just physics. It is. And messing with it will lead to what we have right now in UFC 5, where fighters stop instantly no matter how fast they're moving. So I think it's just one of those things that I think we're just gonna have to deal with if the game is to look realistic and also be responsive. And again, remember, this could be an incentive for why you should perhaps not move as fast as possible and instead occasionally feather the stick and stalk your opponent, because then stalking will actually allow you to move and change directions on a dime. So here's the bottom line. If EA wants UFC 6 to succeed and to be different, to look different from the past games, they need to give movement the attention it deserves. Players are tired of the same old movement style, and a new movement system could completely change the game. It is extremely important, in my opinion, to try to figure out a way to find a balance between realism and responsiveness. Now, with that said, with all that I just said, let's just keep one thing in mind. This is still a video game, and if I had to choose between something that looks great and something that plays great, I'm always going to pick gameplay. That's what keeps players engaged. So if they can't find a happy medium, I just want to make sure I say this right now. If they can't find a happy medium, I would definitely stick to making sure that everything feels as responsive as possible. That is way more important than things looking realistic. The responsiveness of the controls, having full control of your character, is significantly more important than anything else, and I think they should always lean more towards that. That's it for now. Give me your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll see you boys later.